Resident Evil is one of the most popular video game franchises of all time, beginning all the way back in the 90s. And what happens with most video game franchises? They get made into a movie franchise. The newest addition into this franchise, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, is a reboot of the films that had come prior to this one. And with Welcome to Raccoon City, we now have 7 live action movies to rank, so we'll do that starting from the worst and moving up to the best. Before we get into it though, my experience with these games is I've played the first one and I am currently playing the second one, so I don't have as much knowledge when it comes to these games as other people, so my opinions on these movies may not match the same intensity as others. However, I do still have some strong opinions on those films, so without further ado, let's get into it. Coming in at 7th and last place is Resident Evil Retribution. This is a prime example of this franchise where it takes the smallest of plot and stretches it out to fill up a whole movie's runtime. And if you take something small and stretch it really far, you're going to end up with some holes in it. And with those many holes, they attempt to cover it up with some action sequences. They're just not that impressive. And with some of those other holes, they use a weak excuse to bring back previous dead characters, but just the overall context of the situation just makes it confusing and hard to follow. The films we'll talk about in this video, there is some kind of sense to certain areas, but this one I just couldn't really latch onto and really disliked my time watching this film. Coming in at 6th place is Resident Evil Apocalypse. This being the second one into the franchise, which follows on from Resident Evil, which we'll talk about later on in this video. That was a contained story, but this one attempts to widen this world out, and the way it does, it just doesn't feel natural. And as I mentioned, I'm not the biggest Resident Evil video game fan, but I could sense when they were trying to force in some fan service, and it just didn't feel like it made too much sense for the situation other than, trying to deliver that fan service. And in its attempts to get to the fan service areas of this film, it seems to just want to rush through everything else. It's like, okay, we have this idea of bringing in this character who fans of the video game franchise will know. We have to find a way to get there, and they just kind of rush through that aspect. And by rushing, it literally, some scenes felt like they were a montage through certain areas, locations that the video game fans would know. So it just came across extremely and unnecessarily fast-paced. However, there are also scenes which are put into slow motion, which they're trying to make it epic, but it just comes across annoying. And as soon as it goes into slow motion, I'm there looking at my watch, waiting for that slow motion sequence to be over. This film doubles down on the cheesiness, and I just couldn't get on board with it, because in reality, I'm just not a big fan of things when they go really self-aware like this did. And in doing so, it took a very simple plot, which is a recurring theme in this franchise, and they just made it overly convoluted. Coming in at 5th place is Resident Evil The Final Chapter. While this was the final chapter in the franchise, it certainly was only the final Resident Evil movie for about 5 years, and this finally puts an end to Paul W.S. Anderson's Resident Evil franchise, which, to be honest, I had no idea how it went on for this long. However, it did not end on a positive note. It continued the trend of the majority of these films being painful to sit through. I could cover the same areas just like I have previously in this video. This film takes a straightforward plot, stretches it out, and somehow makes it to 90 minutes long. I will criticize this whatever, but I can normally look past it a little bit if the action scenes that are taking place are entertaining and offer me enjoyment. But I'll be honest, this is some of the worst action I have ever seen in a movie, and especially one of this caliber, one with such a big budget. And it's not just because the choreography was bad, because you could actually see that, but what makes this so horrible is the editing. And watching this for the first time about a week ago, that's something that immediately stood out amongst this film, and to be honest, probably the lowest point of the franchise. And since then, watching everyone else's reviews, they agree with me. It probably averages about a change in shot every half a second, if even that, because I literally got a headache from watching every action scene where I just needed to pause and regain some brain cells if I could. This final entry is lifeless, and it's carried by actors who are just trying to get that final paycheck from this franchise, as they do not really care. And to be honest, even if they did, I'm not like they could put in a good performance with the script they were given. There is a final twist which may give this a little bit of an increase in score. However, it it's not much, if anything, pity points, because this is another bad film within this franchise. Coming in at fourth place is Resident Evil Afterlife. After its step in the right direction with a film that we'll talk about later on, we have returned to the over-the-top action scenes with cheesy music and unnecessary slow motion, which make for some painful scenes. However, there is still a little bit of an enjoyment to have in certain areas. Now, that's not me saying it's a good film, because it's not, but the concept of ripping off Dawn of the Dead, whilst bringing in some familiar and cliche aspects, did make it feel like it was something watchable rather than just the abomination of what is yet to come with these films. There's no denying the story's cohesion is seriously flawed, as it just jumps from one thing to the other with little setup or reasoning or even a conclusion. I'm not saying I did, but I could see if someone looked at their phone for maybe 2 minutes and looked back up to the screen, you could be in a whole new location with new characters and you'll be seriously confused. But then again, I could say that for all these films in this franchise. But with this film being in fourth place, I'm pretty much saying it's bad, but it's not horrible. It does have some watchable moments, not necessarily the action sequences, but it's an improvement over what we've covered in this ranking so far. Moving into the top 3 with Resident Evil. This was actually quite a hard top 3 to place, because by no means are they good films, but they offer something unique in their own terms. It's weird looking back at this film after seeing the franchise it spawned in the film industry, because this is a self-contained, cheesy zombie action film, whereas the other ones are open world abominations. As for a video game adaptation, this one works well enough given it's in the Umbrella Corporation environment. It does offer some fun-ish zombie action, but doesn't cover anything that we haven't seen before. Every character is pretty much instantly forgettable, especially if you haven't played through the games, because not only do they not stick out, but they just don't really have any chemistry together. As mentioned, it's nothing out of the ordinary, it's nothing special, but it does provoke quite an 80s vibe, so if you're someone who's into that, it might appeal to you. It certainly leaves space for improvements to be made in future films, which, well, I guess technically did happen since this isn't first in the ranking, but it didn't use those opportunities well, should I say. Coming in at second place is Resident Evil Extinction. I'll be honest, I thought this was a step in the right direction for the franchise, albeit I did kind of think it should have been ended by this point, but I feel like they eliminated many of the outdated aspects and the cheesiness and took a more serious vibe, and while that doesn't really work for these films if you try and take them too seriously, I think it worked okay on this instant. The action is much improved on, although it's still not great, but it's the best we've had in this franchise up to this point. It gets rid of those slow motion and cheesy music sequences, so I found it somewhat enjoyable, and the environment it was in, the Mad Max-esque world, I also thought suited it well. A weird detail to point out, but I actually found this also more enjoyable to look at rather than watch, because Resident Evil Apocalypse, I just felt it was too dark, not as in the tone, but just the environment. I don't know, it didn't make it that enjoyable. I don't know, I can't really pinpoint an exact point, but this one was more colourful and bright, maybe that's why. So it was more attractive to look at. The story progresses in a much more natural way, rather than awkward jump cuts and plot conveniences. This is not me praising this film for being a good film, it still is not great, but I think it's the best that Paul W.S. Anderson had produced. Coming in at first place is Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. Not only do I think that this is the best Resident Evil film, but I also think it's the most faithful to its source material. Now, as I mentioned, I've only played the first 2, and well, this film is based off the first 2. It reboots the franchise to its roots and focuses more on zombie-esque horror survival rather than just Umbrella Corporation conspiracies. It's more of a horror film than an action film like the other ones had been. From my experience playing these first 2 games, I was happy to see this environment and how this film played out. However, there were some bits which did fall flat with how the story progressed, and what perhaps my main issue was the characters. Now, I could be controversial saying this, but from my experience playing the 2 Resident Evil games, well, the second one which I'm still in the process of playing, the characters themselves don't actually get too much development, as, you know, they're by themselves, they're not talking to anyone, but In this film, they just felt extremely bland. I didn't really buy them as those certain characters. We have all seen the quality of video game movies being adapted, you know, they haven't really been great. So it's obvious that adapting one video game into a film is hard enough given that video game has over 10 hours of story to cover. Welcome to Raccoon City gave themselves a disadvantage by trying to combine two into one, and I think that ultimately suffers. Well, it's so much content to try and shove in, which they just ultimately couldn't. This film offers a lot of fan service, from the locations, creatures, characters, literally just straight up shots, you know, the one where the first zombie they encounter turns around to look at them while it's eating someone. I spotted that straight out of the first game. However, if you're not a die-hard Resident Evil fan, and you don't have the past experience with the characters in the games, you're not really going to care about them in this film. So while it may be a great thing for Resident Evil fans, for mainstream goers, maybe not so much. However, this isn't me saying this is a good film, because it's very, very average, but I think it's an adaptation of the Resident Evil property which has finally been done some kind of justice, which fans will be, I'd say, satisfied with. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what your Resident Evil ranking is down below, and I'm interested to hear about your experience with the games as well. If you actually want to, leave your ranking of them down below. Last year I actually considered making a Resident Evil video game franchise up until I realised that there were a lot of games. That isn't a video which will be coming anytime soon, if ever, but I would like to do more video game rankings, as I think I've only done 2 before, but it's just always hard when there's video game franchises which contain so many games. I will say though, Resident Evil 2 is one of the more stressful experiences I have had playing a game. I only play in like half-an-hour sections because I get too stressed out with the environment it's in and just how creepy it is. Yeah, I'd like to hear what you think of Resident Evil as a whole, but as for the movie franchise, I don't really like it at all. If you couldn't tell by my scores, I had quite a miserable time watching all W.S. Anderson's films. As for this reboot, I had some enjoyment. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.